Ladies and gentlemen, this is my second video on the subject of Australian independence and armed neutrality. This time around we're going to go back a little bit in time to discuss Australia's evolution into the current situation where we are today, with two main superpowers vesting interests in Australia with a third in the wings. Back in the 1970s, Australia was then caught between the rivalry of the two great superpowers, the USA and the USSR. But after 1971, the USA played a very devious game by opening up the doors to China. This was something that would have enormous impact on our region and on the security of our country. Back then in the 1970s, the political left often talked, strange as it may sound to us today, about the idea of Australian independence. But most of the leftists who talked then about Australian independence only ever conceived it as some sort of exercise in making Australia independent of the USA and the USSR, but of course never independent of our enmeshment into Asia, and certainly not independent of the new rising China. In 1977, and I mention this by way of anecdote, I went to an interview with a student journalist. The interview was conducted by a Mr. E.F. Azzopardi, who was a well-known Australian nationalist of the day, and during the interview he said to the young writer about the three superpowers. The young writer said, "Surely you mean two?" And he said, "No, I mean three." He said, "China is already too large to be considered as some sort of lower ranking power, although it might not be large enough by way of the weapons and the weapons systems and so on of the USA and the USSR. The concept of three superpowers has been a fixed thing in Australian nationalist writing ever since. It was certainly radical in the 1970s and early 80s because it made it clear that the picture that was often being sold to Australians was not the true one. Yes, there was a contention between the USA and the USSR, most assuredly so, but this other power lurking in the wings. Alex Norrick, a well-known nationalist writer, was one of the first people to speak in 1977-78 of the idea of a Peking-Tokyo-Washington axis. And indeed, for a very long time, the USA operated a foreign policy which involved being aligned very closely with Peking and with Tokyo. The American system regarded these two powers as very useful economically, and they regarded it likely that the benefits of trade would somehow or other open China to further penetration by the USA. What they didn't count on, of course, is the Chinese operated, as historians would well expect, their own agenda. But, as Norrick put it, the idea of a Peking-Tokyo-Washington axis was to rid us of a superpower, namely the USSR. And over those years through the 1980s, the USSR was weakened and weakened until such a point in 1990-91 that it collapsed. It was succeeded, of course, as we know, by the modern Russian state, which, by our analysis, is too powerful to be a medium-ranking power, although it is no longer on the same level as the USA and China. Understanding how the US system works is very important to understanding where we are today. Make no mistake, China's rise didn't come from nowhere any more than bin Laden came from nowhere as a terrorist. Just as the CIA funded bin Laden many years in the 1980s to humble the USSR, so it was that the USA opened up trade, investment and technology transfers to China to facilitate its rise. If the US superpower now complains that China is a threat, and indeed it is a threat to all, they are indeed the power which has created it. Back in the 1970s, if we go back again in time, there emerged a very small Australian nationalist movement centred both on young nationalists who were quite open in their profession of a nativist Australian political and ideological ideal, but also many people who'd come out of the anti-immigration movements who had seen the great betrayal of 1966. You might say that the two streams merged into an awareness that Asia was a new power reality that would one day simply swallow Australia. In a book by Booker, a foreign policy expert, called The Last Quarter, he makes it absolutely clear after 1975 that there was only one power in the world who may in fact tolerate the preservation of some sort of European Australia, and it was not our American ally, and it was certainly not rising China, but it was in fact, ironically and quite paradoxically for some, the old USSR. We may now conclude that its particular geopolitical mission being passed over to the modern Russia still holds true. Russia has no fundamental interest in Australia being Asianised. Russia has much interest in Australia's trade and geostrategic position in balancing off the other two superpowers. That will of course be a matter for another time. The three superpowers today, the two dominant ones, the USA and China, are in absolute contention. The third superpower stands in the wings, namely Russia. The two that are heading to an inevitable clash in one way or another involve Australia in their machinations. In recent times we have seen various members of the trader class going off to Washington to sing the praises of the US superpower. We've also seen other representatives of this class go to China and talk about the need for increased Chinese trade and investment, and that Australia must get the balance right. Even those who go off to the USA and talk about our ally and our permanent friend and so forth also talk about China and its trade and investment and so forth. Those who are, shall we say, more craven towards China, then they acknowledge the USA as well. But we see the rivalry inside our own ruling class. This contention is fed by both superpowers as they claw out influence over the Australian economy and the Australian infrastructure of politics. The three superpowers, of course, contest generally for global hegemony, but we now live in the time of the rise of one to challenge for global hegemony. China recently celebrated its 70th anniversary as the People's Republic of China, and we saw the massive hardware military displays put out by President Xi. President Xi, you might say, had fused together the styles both of Hitler and Mao to present an image of total power. The declining US superpower now has to fight against a power that it itself has created. For Australia, of course, we must realise the obvious. One Chinese academic who came recently to Australia actually scoffed and laughed and said that the two superpowers may fight here over you. We Australians would dread, of course, such a thing. At the same time, we must ask ourselves another question. If, as several patriots are now saying in their own publications, and nationalists too are saying in their own publications, what if the price of the avoiding of a war between those two states was the redivision of the world, and in particular the redivision of a small country in the South Pacific called Australia? Would, for argument's sake, the United States really risk nuclear holocaust, supposedly to keep the Australian suburban idiot free? Really? Why would the types that have spawned the Clintons and the Bidens and even the Trumps, why would they possibly do such a thing out of the goodness of their heart? The bottom line is they wouldn't. From the Chinese point of view, of course, they certainly don't want nuclear holocaust either, although Mao said, so what? If half the world perishes, he said, and the remaining half were on our side of the ideological fence, who would care? Well, maybe the Chinese aren't as foolhardy as Mao these days, but the principle is still the same. The Chinese look at Australia as a very, very valuable piece of real estate, and to repartition it is something that I have very little doubt, and many of our nationalist-minded activists and others have got very little doubt, may indeed be contemplated. For Australia, the only way out of the rivalry of superpowers in a world that we simply don't control is the obvious one. It's the assertion of Australian independence and the adoption of a policy of armed neutrality. Australia cannot govern whether or not 2 or 3 superpowers fight. There's nothing Australia can do about that. The only thing we can do is secure our own interests. Let me sum up with this. Through the long time now that there has been a conscious nationalist movement in Australia, we've always looked at the question of how to actually win Australian independence. It's clear that in a world of superpowers, Australia has to exit itself. We have to balance them, one against the other and one against the other too, in leaving this system. It is the system of superpowers that is the problem. Thank you.